All right, a little earlier than planned, but here we are. Of course, you all know the answer about Brexit and about the US election. It's all so clear. And it's exactly what you'd have been thinking about weeks ago, months ago, these unthinkables which are happening now. And it was always on your agenda. And of course, I know for most of you, it hasn't been on your agenda, but now you're waking up to the implications of Brexit, which many of you didn't scope, and the possibility of a surprise, maybe, by your standards, of what's going to happen in the US election. So this is really your chance to put questions, to hear about what's happening, to hear what the judgment is today on a Saturday in Singapore. Not just about what's happening in Europe and the Bratislava meeting of the 27, not the 28, because Britain is not there, the United Kingdom is not there. And then, of course, what's happening in the United States, notwithstanding Donald Trump getting his hair ruffled by Jimmy Fallon, which is the major event of the US election, quite apart from Hillary Clinton's pneumonia and the fact that she's back on the trail. So the deal is this: we're going to talk for about 50 minutes. I want you to be part of it. Please use the app. It's working very well. It allows me to know which of you want to come in. And it is about enlightenment, and we are on the record in this discussion, so it's a public event, essentially. Before we get going, or as we get going, I'd like each of my three guests to really explain what they have been doing and what their role has been, first in Brexit, and secondly in the US presidential election campaign on both sides of the argument and both sides of the campaign. First, Peter Mandelson, quickly, before we get into the detail, just tell us what you were doing during the campaign and what you've been doing since.
Very simply, I was one of the early organizers of the Remain campaign. I, a Conservative Party colleague and a Liberal Democrat colleague, were asked a year ago by funders to put together the Remain campaign, which we did and organized it before the government then finally took over in the running of it, and the rest is history. So in that sense, I started my campaign life, or my political life, as the architect of a great victory in New Labour, and have ended it as an architect of a great defeat. Thank you.
Is it a war or just a battle? This one, quickly, very quickly.
No, it's a war on Europe. This is the beginning of the story of Brexit, not the end of it.
All right, Jim Messina, welcome.
Thank you.
You've got offices all over the place. Where are your offices now?
We have offices in D.C., New York, San Francisco, and London. I was Barack Obama's campaign manager and White House Deputy Chief of Staff. Then I advised David Cameron in the 2015 elections, and then in his role in the Brexit campaign. And now I advise prime ministers and presidents in Italy, UK, Spain, and Argentina. And I'm co-chair of Hillary's super PAC.
It's important that what you're doing in Italy at the moment with the referendum there with Ferenzi, correct?
Yes.
The Prime Minister.
We have a November referendum that will be seen as the second chance at a Brexit vote. I don't think it's actually a second chance at a Brexit vote, but it will be a very much publicized election around the world.
So what we're talking about here is a process of which Brexit is probably the opening chapter, and there are many other things about to happen, certainly in Europe, including in Italy and elsewhere in Europe as well. Matt.
Thank you very much for having me. I was Mitt Romney's campaign manager. Got to spend a lot of time thinking about Jim Messina, the guy at the end, in 2012. After the campaign, I set up a super PAC called America Rising. It's very involved in this presidential election cycle. It focuses on earned media and driving negative news narratives against Democrats all across our political landscape.
What's your relationship to the Trump campaign?
America Rising has been literally the first organization, one of the first organizations to hold Hillary Clinton accountable going back to 2013. We have consistently and nonstop held her accountable for the things she does, including the Clinton Foundation. We were one of the original groups to pitch a story in the press about the Clinton Foundation and the use of the Clinton Foundation by the Clintons, not as a charitable organization, but more or less a slush fund for their political activities.
All right, so what we want to do is draw out a number of themes which are emerging both from Brexit and also from Italy and what's happening in the United States at the moment. So with a bit of luck, I don't need to get involved because they're going to talk to each other with a bit of help from you. So please do get those questions coming in, and I'll just keep prompting them. But there are a number of critical issues we want to explore. First of all, let's hear the Brexit perspective, Peter. What are the issues you'd like to raise about why, what next, and also the dangers of EU disintegration?
I think what's interesting...
Could you just switch the microphone a little closer to you? Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I think what is interesting about the Brexit campaign is the state of mind and attitudes of the voters, behind the campaign and which led to the result. I mean, let's not become completely suicidal about the result. I mean, it was 52-48. The Remain campaign, was not buried by a landslide. It was, however, an emphatic result. When we were talking in the opening session that you did, Nick, this morning about, the state of mind, the attitudes and values of consumers, it reminded me of some research that was done after the referendum campaign about the attitudes and values of those who voted to leave, who defeated the referendum proposition by the government. And I went back to look at that research and made a note of it. I think it's very interesting. I just want to come back to it in one moment, but to say, first of all, as far as the campaign itself was concerned, just so that we're clear about this, I would say the reasons for the defeat can be boiled down to three factors. The first is that there has been a 30-year story of the British public being skeptical of, never really falling in love with the European Union. And a fringe idea that Britain should leave the European Union migrated during the course of that 30 years into the public mainstream opinion. In the campaign itself, that sort of general skepticism, reinforced by Europe's recent experience, stuttering growth, refugee crisis, terrible terrorist incidents, all this sort of reinforced a negativity about the European Union and led many people to a default position, which was that if the economic cost or the risk of leaving was not too great, then they would probably leave. Second point, the economic risk of leaving never became the preeminent sort of issue in the campaign. What happened was that the public received two fairly equally matched messages about the economic consequences of leaving from the Remain and the Leave campaign, not helped by the fact that the government itself was divided in the views it offered about the economic consequences of leaving. And of course, my own party, the Labour Party, was generally speaking feeble throughout. Now, therefore, economic risk never became, it never made the difference in the way that we anticipated it would, and instead, third point, immigration replaced economic risk as the most salient issue in the public's mind. And this great slogan of the Leave campaign, which was "Take Back Control," which, if you think about it for one moment, can be applied to so many different issues and levels of thinking. Take back control was, at one level, take back control of our borders and limit foreigners, European migrants coming to Britain. But it can be applied in a number of different ways. And it was basically classless. It appealed as much to low-income people as it did high-income people. And what we found is that when we in the Remain campaign were sort of talking economics, the public were talking back to us about immigration. But there was something more basic about the public's attitude to the government, to the Remain campaign, which they saw very much as the elite, very much as the establishment. And basically what people were saying is, okay, I hear what you're saying, but why should I believe you? Why should I believe you? Actually, when I think about it, why should I even listen to you? I mean, look at my situation. Look how you've performed in government. Look how what the mainstream parties have delivered. Actually, I'm going to go my own way and make up my own mind. Now, let me come back quickly to the original point. What was going on in the minds of Leave campaigners? What were the issues? What were the values that they were thinking about when they got out of bed in the morning? Let me just read to you what Leave voters regard as a force for ill in Britain, in British society. Multiculturalism, that's people of different races and colours living together in Britain. 81% think this is a force for ill in Britain. Social liberalism, a sort of live and let live attitude that champions minorities. 80% of Leave voters thought that social liberalism was an ill in Britain. Feminism. 74% of Leave voters, not every one of them, of course, but 74% thought that feminism was an ill in society. Greens and all their thinking, 78% bad. Globalisation. 69% of Leave voters thought that globalisation is a force for ill in Britain. And immigration, 80% think that immigration is bad for Britain. Now, the point about that is that it reveals, and by the way, the Remain voters almost exactly mirrored all those figures in all those categories, but believing that it was a good for society and a good for Britain. Therefore, what these figures indicate are profound divisions in society. Secondly, that they do not break along conventional left-right party lines. There are as many people who are Labour voters who are subscribing to these negative views as there were Conservative ones. And that secondly, it leaves precious little middle ground between these sets of polarized attitudes and values in society for politicians, who are in the center really to find. And what we have to come to terms with, those of us who have been centrist politicians, been leading members of mainstream parties, as I have all my life and as I still passionately believe in, we have to realize that there's a vast swathe of the population out there who just think that they've been patronized, who think they've been sneered at, that their views have been dismissed, and that they have been ignored. And they are not going to take it any longer. And what the referendum was an opportunity for them to bite back, to say, stop lecturing me, you metropolitan liberal elite. I'm fed up with your views. If you want to have anything to do with me, then descend, if you will, from Mount Olympus and talk to me direct. Otherwise, please clear off. And that is basically the message I believe that many of the public are giving, not just in Britain, but in Europe as a whole, but also in the United States and across the West. And I hope it's not coming to Asia anytime soon.
Would you have expected to say that before the referendum? In other words, were the political class led by Cameron and Osborne, who were pushing for the referendum, were they aware of it? Were you aware of it as well?
Right from the beginning, we thought this was a colossally bad idea. I mean, to give the British people a choice of whether they want to stay in or leave the European Union, given the troubles that the European Union is going through, as I've described, never struck anyone as a brilliant idea. George Osborne, Michael Gove, from different sides of the Conservative Party divide on this issue, both said to Cameron, don't do it. But Cameron thought he had no alternative. He thought that he had to sort of, in a sense, take the fight to the populist right, both within and to the right of his own party, and defeat them, because if he didn't, then they would come for him in the middle of the night and he'd be out of the door. So that's what he decided to do, and he's a very self-confident, almost breezy sort of politician, and he thought that this sort of tactical gamble would pay off, and of course it has turned into a strategic blunder, which we have now to live with. And live with it we will, and make the best of it and minimize the damage.
All right. Now, the complication here is, do I go down the Brexit route, or do we actually now introduce the US route? So let's try and introduce the US route to find out where the similarities are. And if I could just say, Peter, there is a marvelous quote which I still have brutally in my mind. It's from Michael Gove, the former Justice Secretary, former co-leader of the Brexit campaign, who, when he was woken up at 4:45 in the morning on the 24th of June, his wife, who's a columnist for the Daily Mail, said, quoting Michael Caine in The Italian Job, "You're only meant to blow the bloody doors off, not actually rob the bank at the same time."
Yeah.
In other words, the calculation went a bit further than they expected, correct?
That is absolutely true, but for the reasons I've said, when you think back on it, I mean, the result was almost inevitable given all the circumstances, and actually we did rather well to get 48% of the vote.
On a turnout of 36%.
No, the turnout was 70%.
70,
in effect, 37% only
didn't.
of the British public,
Yes.
as opposed to those voting, voted to leave the European Union. 37%.
Right. Let's pause. We've got some questions on Brexit. Jim and Matt, your perspectives now, not least because you were advising the Conservative Party in the last election, but try and morph this into what's now happening
No
in
problem.
the US, please.
I think what you see around the world is what I call the rise of nationalism. You see this in the Brexit vote. You see it in the rise of Donald Trump on the right, Bernie Sanders on the left. You see it in the rise of Le Pen in France. The Austrian elections have just occurred. And it is really about three things. It is about, if you look at people who are Brexiters and you look at Trump voters, they're almost exactly the same. And the number one characteristic that predicts them is a lack of college education. The second is an absolute, to Peter's point, opposition to immigration. Third is a worry about globalization and the countries in it. In my home country, it is unthinkable 10 years ago that now both nominees of both parties are anti-trade and have come out against the major trade deals. You would not, Matt and I wouldn't have expected that 5 years ago, much less 10 years ago, and now it is very true. Those winds of nationalism are now sweeping across the world and have not hit Asia yet, but are clearly, you're seeing it in the referendum in Italy right now, as more and more people want to sit back and say, hey, we want to control our own destiny and try to get out. The majority of people who voted for Brexit were trying to send a message to the elites that they wanted to pull up the drawbridge and attempt to stay away from these things they could not change. This is going to get worse, not better, with the rise of technology and a continued reliance on new ways to create jobs. And if you're in the middle of the Midwest in the United States or in the West Country in England, you have an economic worry about the future and where those jobs are going to come from. And the way voters are now looking at it are, let's walk away and stop being part of the global community because maybe we can control it. We know that that is not true, that globalization actually long-term is absolutely crucial, but politics have changed rapidly and made that very, very different. Donald Trump is proposing a 50% tax on all goods coming from China. The Republican nominee for president would never do that 4 years ago when Matt was running Romney and I was doing Obama. Hillary's come out against the president's trade deals. That was also surprising for the former Secretary of State, and I think reflects our changed politics.
Let me just be clear. Would you be using the same language as Peter in the British context? Vast swathes of the population who don't want to be patronized, who say they've been ignored, this disconnect between the political class and the people?
Look, I think you're seeing that across the world, right? That is the rise of Donald Trump. The number two thing people who support him say is they want to send a message to the elites that they're not being listened to. And I think you see that in the United Kingdom. You see that all over. Washington is a 10 square mile logic-free zone that
A logic-free zone.
Logic-free zone that has no sort of ability to communicate with average American voters. I think London, 91% of financial elite in London thought that Brexit was going to fail the day before it passed. That is being out of touch with voters.
All right, Matt, just before I come to you, but Peter, can I just pick up on that one point which Jim said about Trump? Lack of college education. You wouldn't say that about a lot of Brexiteers, would you?
Well, the people who voted to leave were more older people, especially retirees, and those who had lower educational qualifications. Yes,
yeah, it's the same. It's exactly the same.
But you could still end up at dinner parties in London with people amazing who all...
No, that's true, because there were this sort of take back control sort of simplistic slogan, was very effective for well-off people, the sort of rather cushioned, well-off, ultra-comfortable London elite, who just thought it would be a jolly good piece of fun to poke those Brussels people in the eye and just show them that, good old Blighty can get up and stand on its own 2 feet all over again. Yeah. Well,
I think you represent those conversations rather well, Peter, if I may say. Matt, just picking up on what Jim has said, can you build on it from the Republican side, please?
Yeah, from the Republican side, Donald Trump winning the Republican nomination for president has been in the works for a long time in our country. And it really goes back to 2005. I was on the Bush-Cheney reelect, and we won, and we believed we had a mandate, and we started to try to deliver on the president's agenda. And one of the first items we worked on, and I was at the Republican National Committee at the time, was entitlement reform. And during the course of the 2004 campaign, we had really taken 2 issues off the table for Democrats to use against the president. One was health care, because the president had signed a Medicare prescription drug bill, and the other was immigration. The president actually was for a form of immigration reform, and it allowed us to win border states like New Mexico in 2004. But quickly we realized in the very early part of 2005, as exciting as entitlement reform was to talk about, whenever you did an interview, even in what was perceived as friendly places like talk radio with our conservative base, all they wanted to talk about was immigration. And it was the beginning of this transformation, the populism building in the Republican Party. In 2010, the Republican Party took back the U.S. House of Representatives, and many of these populists were elected in the process. And then in 2012, before we won the honor of going up against Jim and President Obama, we had a very, very contested Republican primary, and I think a lot of people took for granted Mitt's victory within the party. And Mitt Romney wasn't running against Rick Santorum or Newt Gingrich. He was running against all this populism, all this anger that Donald Trump 4 years later was able to tap into, and being the communicator that he is, take the nomination.
Do you want to tell us about that experience you had when you had an audience in Trump Tower?
Yeah, so Donald Trump endorsed Mitt Romney during the Republican primary in 2011. And as Mitt's campaign manager, I spent most of my days in Boston, where our campaign headquarters was located. And I had a lot of time on my hands to watch a lot of cable news. And every Monday morning on Fox News, which is where especially Republican primary voters go to get their news, Mr. Trump would do his now famous call-in interviews. And he would call in every Monday morning, and he would strip the bark off of Mitt Romney. And he would say things like, Mitt was a small businessman, he's never run a big company. He would attack Massachusetts health care as the roadmap to Obamacare. And every political reporter that was covering us at the time would write off of his comments. And so we would start each week with what we call in the business a negative info flow, thanks to Mr. Trump. And so I was a big supporter of let's bring Mr. Trump into the tent and let's seek his endorsement. And with Mitt's blessing, I traveled up to New York City, or down to New York City, to meet with Mr. Trump at Trump Tower. And I had known and was well aware of Donald Trump. I had grown up in upstate New York, and I was a sports fan, a New York sports fan, and Donald Trump had been on the front page of the tabloids since I was in the second grade. And I was well aware of his power. It didn't take, this primary to learn that. So I go to Trump Tower, and I'm a young guy. I kind of expected I could get big-footed by Mr. Trump. And sure enough, when I got there, I met his lawyer who said that, unfortunately, Mr. Trump couldn't make the meeting, but he'd like to talk to me. And so I sat in his lawyer's office for about 30 minutes, answering a variety of questions, and I was well prepared, laying out the reasons why I thought Mr. Trump should endorse Mitt, why we want his endorsement. And about 30 minutes into this meeting, I started realizing these questions were very leading, almost like I was giving answers for a jury or some third party. And we got to a final question, and the lawyer was like, essentially how great Mr. Trump is. And again, I was highlighting why we wanted his endorsement, and all of a sudden, voice of God, Donald Trump answered the question. And it turns out he had been listening to the entire conversation. Luckily, I was on message, and Donald liked what he heard, and we did get his endorsement. Jim would later attack us, but in the Republican primary, and going back to my point, these are the things you needed to do to secure the nomination in the current environment that we live in.
All right, let's try and pick. There are a lot of points coming in here, which I'm going to try and coalesce without necessarily quoting anybody. And there are other points I will pick up in a moment. But do you just agree with Jim about lack of college education, immigration, and anti-globalization?
I think you guys are diminishing the argument by saying lower educated. I think people in Washington, D.C. have lost touch with how much pain there is in the economy, and they watch too much CNBC and too much Fox Business News and have become disconnected with regular Americans. They just don't understand just because the stock market does well doesn't mean that someone out in Iowa is doing well.
Okay, now let's pick up that slogan, take back control in the UK, but some of the sloganizing that's happened in the Trump campaign, stuff which is simple, crude, emotive, and pretty vacuous. You don't quite know what it means, but it sounds good. How much is that now a new problem? There are a couple of questions here about that already. Peter, and all three of you, about the easy way in which you can put an idea in which doesn't really have much meaning.
I don't think simplistic slogans in themselves work. They're not effective.
They're appealing.
Well, look, you have to have two things if you're a sort of populist nationalist of the sort that Trump is. You have to be a strong, powerful personality. You do, yes, have to use simplistic slogans. You have to use angry, bombastic rhetoric because you're giving voice to what people feel. And you have to have good use of social media platforms to broadcast your views. You need all those things, not just simplistic slogans. And secondly, the slogans that you do have got to resonate with people. I mean, the thing about Take Back Control is that it's a slogan that could mean quite a few things. I mean, it resonated with a lot of the views and values that I've described in those very high percentages. And take back control is let's take back control from the social liberals. Let's take back control from the feminists. Let's take back control from the multiculturalists. Let's take back control from people who think that foreign workers are better than British workers, for example. It works in so many ways, but crucially works across age groups, it works across classes, and it works across conventional party allegiances.
But what I'm trying to get to is, are we seeing slogans now which are meaningless, which win votes, but don't actually have policy?
No. You're seeing slogans that are not meaningless. They mean a lot to the people who are hearing them. So that when people hear, let's make America great again, that can mean quite a lot of things, actually. Let's make American manufacturers great again and not have all these sort of people from China and Asia coming over and eating our lunch. Let's make America great again, and by the way, let's also make it white. I mean, and so it goes on.
Jim,
it
Matt,
means something.
Yeah, look, I think, Nick, what you're talking about, a slogan is a tactic. The much more interesting tactic here, which I think Donald Trump is the single best in the world at, is social media. Social media is how Donald Trump spent less than every single Republican on television or a campaign and won a nomination that literally no one expected him to have. In the United Kingdom in 2015, 73% of all undecided voters made up their mind in the final week using social media, what their friends and family said. Barack Obama became the first president since Richard Nixon in 1972 to win a majority of the undecided. When you asked them why, 82% said they were contacted on social media by a friend or family member. That authentication in this age of cynicism, in this age of anger, is way more important than a slogan. I agree with Peter. I think slogan is way over wrought for what this is. A slogan is a definition of your message. But the much more interesting thing for people here is how that message is being delivered, and that message is now being delivered in a way that people can no longer control. In the old days, you'd have a daily press clip. We now measure, on both Matt and I, measure our campaign's effectiveness every 5 minutes on social media. When Barack Obama lost to Mitt Romney in the first debate, we went back and realized that the press had decided in the 8th minute on Twitter that we had lost the debate and wrote all their stories before the 8th minute was done of a 90-minute debate. That is the power of social media.
Social media is just transforming every aspect of life. The positive side of social media in U.S. politics is that in all of my years in politics, social media is really the first thing that I've seen come along that actually provides real campaign finance reform. And that goes to Jim's point. It levels the playing field, where people are able to get across their message in a much cheaper form. And people are going around, voters are going around the traditional media to find out their information and news. I think the term slogan is antiquated. And not to take any greatness away from Make America Great Again, but it's been his mastery, Donald Trump's mastery of social media, owning 2 to 3 news cycles a day using his Twitter handle is just amazing.
What about what happened earlier this week with the war veterans?
Yeah, again.
With Trump.
Again, Mr. Trump and his ability to be the news. You know, he went out and told American media outlets that he was going to have a new position or make news on whether or not President Obama was born in the United States, the birther issue. And he got every major cable news outlet in our country to follow from beginning to end this campaign event that he did that was totally focused on bringing up military veterans to endorse and support his candidacy. And then in the final closing seconds after every cable had gone live, he said, oh yeah, by the way, I might have been wrong about the birther deal. It was brilliant. He's owning them. He's manipulating them. And, you know, they played right into it throughout our primary. They gave him the platform on top of his own Twitter platform, and he just dominated U.S. politics. You can disagree with his message, and I'm sure many in this room do, but you cannot disagree or take away his ability to use communications.
Jim, just tip your microphone down, can you? It's a little bit closer to Peter. You wanted to come in.
The point I wanted to make was this. I think we've just got to look at things a little bit more deeply about what is going on. We have to ask ourselves why those of us who have occupied the center ground of politics in Europe, why those of us who have helped to lead the mainstream parties have lost so much electoral support. Why have so many people turned away and gone to different extremes? It's not that they're turning left or right, notably, but they are turning outwards. And I think that one of the reasons for this is not actually because people are anti-trade or even anti-globalization. It's because they feel that trade has become less fair than it should. They're in favor of global competition. They broadly understand that, but they would like fair global competition. Now, they may not articulate it in quite this way, but I do not think that if you presented the case pro or anti-trade, most people in Britain would say, no, we're against trade. But they do feel that they need politicians and governments who are going to intervene more strenuously to level the playing field, make things fairer, and indeed to protect them. What they feel is not only that they have been not listened to and ignored in many of the values that they have, but also that they have been left behind.
Right,
They've been left behind by governments who have not considered carefully enough why their real wages started becoming so stagnant during the mid-2000s and after, and why it has been so starkly exposed since the global financial crisis. There's such stark income inequalities in society too.
We need to look at the Asian implications. We've got 20 minutes to run. Can we get microphones, please, to V. Shankar from Gateway Partners, also to Martin Sorrell and Paul Pullman. I don't know where you are, but put your microphone, your hands up, and John Howard over there. But one issue about nationalism and populism and persuasion. What about that and the way things are changing there? There's one question here about the middle ground, for example, about how persuasion has taken over, has changed politics. Jim.
Well, look, the U.S. is an interesting election. The U.S. is now the most partisan country in the world. Only between 6 and 8% of voters are actually undecided in this last election. When Matt and I were hammering each other for 2 years of our lives, that number was no more than 8%. You look in the UK 2015 election, where 20 to 25% swing back and forth. There is middle ground that Peter talked about. There are voters there in some of these countries. But what you continue to see in Europe and Latin America is the rise of the third and fourth and fifth parties, because the mainstream parties are not giving voice to some of these issues. You saw it with UKIP in the UK. You know, right now in Italy, you see the opposition party didn't exist 5 years ago, and its leader is actually a clown. That's his profession, not just normal. He's a clown.
It's a growth industry.
Right, exactly right. And those kind of outside politicians.
Is that the way to get elected in future in any country, do you think? Would you make that advice to people?
Look at Donald Trump. Part of why Donald Trump is so good at what he does, he was a reality show host for a very long time, and he's incredibly good at it, and he understands how to push buttons.
He's human.
Right, and so you're seeing more and more non-traditional candidates arise because of this anger at traditional parties and their inability to cope with these problems.
Matt, you said self-deprecation. I don't know if your microphone was open, but that's what you just said.
Yes, Donald, you talked about the Jimmy Fallon moment. That was self-deprecation, making fun of himself, making fun of his hair. Hillary Clinton could use a little bit of that. She has not had...
What would you recommend?
Well, you can't change who she is. And one thing, when I set up America Rising, you know, the candidate is who the candidate is. And I will say I have a lot of respect for Secretary Clinton. I think she's an incredibly intelligent woman. I expected her to be a stronger candidate right out of the gate, though. Going back to 2013, I thought she had a brutal primary in 2008 against a transformational political figure in Barack Obama. She'd had 4 years traveling the world as Secretary of State. You know, I was with Mitt in 2008 when he lost the primary. He wasn't a perfect candidate in 2012, but he had learned and he became better, and that's how he won the nomination.
But to be clear, I mean, have you said to one of your clients, you know, Mr. or Mrs. Secretary or whoever, a little bit of self-deprecation here? Do you think politicians like to do that?
Yeah, it's all about the process now. It's all about people should use their Twitter handle to be self-deprecating as well. And she just...
Peter, were you able to be self-deprecating?
Almost certainly not enough. But the point I was going to make about Hillary is, to me, Hillary strikes me as a normal politician who's playing by conventional rules and conducts herself in politics as if those rules have not changed. She finds the whole sort of swirling social media atmosphere around her rather off-putting. I think she has wrong-footed herself during this campaign. She hasn't been able to get into her stride, whereas Donald Trump never seems to have lost his stride. He seems to revel in this this social media swirl. And actually, I think he does. I think he enjoys every single minute of it, and Hillary just about hates every single second of it.
She doesn't. I totally agree, but I still thought that, I thought she'd improve in a one-on-one interview. I thought she would do better staying on message. I thought she would take on social media and use it to benefit her campaign. She has done none of those things. None of those things.
Well, I think just to be the one defender of Hillary Clinton on the stage, I mean, she's going to be the next president of the United States, so she's doing something right.
Yeah.
She's about to win an electoral college that, every night we do 62,000 computer simulations of the election, and we've done this for 9 years, and it correctly predicted Barack Obama's final vote in Ohio and Florida within 0.1%, and she wins 79% of those simulations. And so I think she's going to be the president.
Jim,
she
what
may
you
not.
said is something very important here. You said the Electoral College. You mean to say that she might lose the popular vote but win the Electoral College vote?
No, I think George Bush did that. It's very hard to do. He was an overachiever. It's very hard to do. She will not. She'll win both of them. And that's the job. The job is not 50%. The job is 270 electoral votes.
But anything could yet happen. Let me just, I've got a lot of questions from you. Most of them are anonymous, which is why I can't recognize whoever wants to ask this question. First of all, to V. Shankar, where are you, please?
I'm here, 60 degrees east, to you. It goes back to the point Lord Mandelson made about the polarization of the electorate. Until, recently, you won an election, think Tony Blair, think President Clinton, you won an election by appealing to the large middle. But increasingly it seems that the left is becoming more left, the right is becoming more right, and there is a disappearing middle. So today, if you were to craft a winning campaign, how would you go about doing it?
All right, thank you. Can I just get a couple of other questions? Paul Pullman, where are you, Paul? Please, have you got the microphone? Yeah, please. Can we get a microphone to Paul Pullman, please? Or Martin Sorrell, do you have a microphone?
Yeah, I do.
You keep it, don't you?
No, not quite.
Well, you keep
nice
it in your
idea,
pocket.
Nick, but I don't.
I can see you.
Question for Jim Messina. The Brexit campaign seemed to coalesce around three issues: the economy, sovereignty, and last but most importantly, immigration. During the course of the campaign, I asked a senior Conservative politician, and I'll say an ex-Conservative politician, which narrows the field of who it might be.
Is that politician still in Parliament?
I said ex-politician, right?
So it's the Prime Minister.
No. Well, sorry,
the former
you're
Prime
narrowing
Minister.
it down to two potential people, and I won't be drawn on that.
Is David or George?
Anyway, I asked why was it that the government was focusing purely on the economy issue. And he told me that you, Jim, had advised, and I wonder whether this is true or not, had advised that you should focus on the economy issue until you thought the electorate was sick of it. Given what happened, do you regret that advice?
Thanks. Can I just check? Paul, do you want to come in quickly?
I just have a quick question. With so much money now coming to Matt, actually, I wanted Matt to answer that. With so much money now coming into the US politics, several billions for this election, for Europeans, it's an amazing number. Focus on a few swing states. Would you still call the US a democracy or not? Question. Second question is, have you read the book Dark Money? Your organization and the active financing of the Koch brothers is mentioned in there quite prominently, and how do you respond to that?
And could I give the microphone to John Howard, please? You've got it. Yeah. John, do you want to come in quickly
too,
as
Matt.
former Australian Prime Minister? Do you recognise these politics we're describing to you?
Well, can I just...
And be quick if you can, because we run...
can I say very quickly, don't demonise slogans. They're part of it. And, I should disclose that I was delighted that Britain voted to leave the European Union. And once the Prime Minister of Britain invited the President of the United States to come to Britain and wave his finger at the British public and say you'll be at the back of the queue, I thought it was open season for people from other parts of the world to express a view. I think the British people made a perfectly logical decision. I believe that once the decision had been taken to have the vote, it was incumbent upon the government and those supporting remaining in the European Union to have a far more convincing case that Britain's relations with the European Union had really changed as a result of the negotiation. And I think the fatal weakness in the Remain campaign, the fatal weakness was that there wasn't sufficient rung from the other 27 member states of the European Union to persuade people. And I'll finish on this. There is nothing new about nationalism. The principal organising position of international affairs is still the nation state. And if you want an eloquent example of the punch packed by the nation state, unencumbered by any kind of regional hegemony, you look at the place that we're now having this conference in.
Thank you. All right, so the middle ground, first of all, from Vishankar.
Yeah, I can do 3 questions very quickly at once, and then Matt can defend his reputation. So one on the economy question that Martin asked, that was my advice in the 2015 election. I went to the party conference and said, if you don't stop talking about economy, you will win. I never said that in the general election. My advice in the referendum was find a way to get the labor leader to do something on turnout, which we were unable to do. So let's be clear on that. The middle ground, there's a huge debate in the United States about turnout versus persuasion. Do you turn your base out the way George Bush did in 2004 to have historic big turnout, or Barack Obama did in 2012, or do you persuade? I think it's a false choice. I think leaders have to do both. And last, to respectfully disagree with the Prime Minister, the worst testing argument in the entire campaign was member states telling the British public what to do. That would have been a disaster. We would have lost by 20 points.
Matt, that question from Paul.
Yeah, 2 parts to that. One is, you used the phrase dark money, which is a book written by a liberal author. That's a phrase that liberals use to describe money spent by conservatives in U.S. politics. I would say, to defend that, there was a lot of money spent by a lot of liberal outside groups in 2012 and before, registering a lot of people to vote in the U.S., and a lot of it was funneled through liberal environmental organizations. Liberals don't call that dark money, but it's the same money. As far as U.S. politics, we do spend a lot of money on political campaigns in our country, and I just believe that that is a freedom of speech issue, and I don't have a problem with it. I go to social media, and I highlight the benefits, because we have, in the time that I've been in U.S. politics, tried to change the laws and have campaign finance reform. And every time we have, it's just led to Democrats and Republicans finding new ways to spend more money on our elections. I think that that is the benefit, though, of social media. But with any benefit comes harm and potential trouble.
Nick, may I respectfully completely disagree with my brother? In the 2008 election with Barack Obama and John McCain, there were $10 million of outside spending. After the Citizens United Supreme Court case in this election, there will be $1.5 billion in outside spending. I'm chair of an organization that will spend several $100 million going negative on Donald Trump. It's my favorite job I've ever had. Matt's chair of the Republican one. I agree with you. This is damaging our democracy and needs to change. Martin.
Could I get the microphone to Anjali Tarapour, please? Peter, do you want to pick up on any of those interventions, particularly from John Howard?
Just wanted to say to John Howard, actually, you're right. I mean, in the polling that was done about President Obama's intervention, I think it was found by a margin of 2-1 that it encouraged people to vote Leave rather than vote Remain. Now, that's as far as I want to go back into the campaign. I am now rather more preoccupied with my team in Global Counsel helping businesses come to terms with the outcome of the referendum. We're helping firms on the trade implications, the human capital, the freedom of movement implications, and the financial services and passporting implications. So let's not go back into the campaign, because we're not likely to be fighting it again unless, of course, we come to a British general election in 2020 when the British public might be offered a further choice, not about the result of the last referendum, but the outcome of what has followed it. And that is a slightly different proposition. I mean, what follows? What are the consequences of the referendum vote? And if we come to a general election in 2020, and the Conservative government has, made a pretty poor job of negotiating our exit, which, to my mind, is a hard exit without seeking common ground or compromise with our European partners. And the Labour Party has sort of vaguely got its act together and has a new leader and can offer a different proposition and say, well, actually, we need as far as we can to stay in Europe's single market and continue trading and doing business with the single market. Then the British people might be offered a further choice between two propositions advocated by the governing and the opposition party. And to be honest, if I had to work for anything now, apart from helping businesses come to terms with the implications, that's what I would be doing politically.
But just to be clear, and Peter, you speak as 5 years as a commissioner in Brussels as well, when you gave up your seat in Parliament before you joined the House of Lords. But what does Brexit mean? Because the new Prime Minister keeps saying Brexit means Brexit, and everyone out there is using the term Brexit. Is it clear what Brexit really means?
Well,
is
it's
it
like
a hard
saying,
departure?
honestly, it's like saying, breakfast means breakfast. I mean, it could be cornflakes or it could be dim sum, depending on your taste. So we are not clearer. I mean, the way I see this happening from now on, there's going to be a process of incremental crystallization. Crystallization on the part of the British government that actually simply saying there are lots of opportunities out there in the world, let's go and get them. I mean, that we have rather fewer options as a country and an economy outside the European Union than they originally maintained. Crystallization on the part of the British public that actually most of our alternatives, most of the other options are inferior in trade and economic terms to what we have at the moment, but also crystallization on the part of our European erstwhile partners, the other member states of the European Union, who I think slowly over the next year or two are going to come to realize that they are going to be losers from a painful divorce between Britain and the European Union, and they have to come to terms with this reality as well.
So the takeaway phrase is incremental crystallization on Brexit.
I'm sorry it's so undignified a word, but...
Anjali Tarapur, where are you, please? I hope the microphone's... Where are you? Are you still here? Speak. Someone... Oh, okay, yes, please. Because you make a very important comment here about the next generation, however you want to define. We can see you now. I can hear you. So go ahead.
The point I wanted to make was the young people didn't vote at this referendum. Is there a lesson in that for the next generation? Thank you.
In other words, the engagement of the next generation who are deeply angry now about the result in Britain, Peter.
No, it's not the truth that they didn't vote. They did not vote in as greater numbers as 60 and 70-year-olds. That's absolutely right. But many did, and 80% of those young people voting, depending on your definition of young, voted to remain. Now, David Cameron was originally toying with the idea of allowing, 16, 17, and 18-year-olds to have the vote. He decided against making that change for the referendum because he thought it would be a bad precedent to set for future British general elections, because he thought his party would lose from that lowering of the voting age in future general elections, and that's why he didn't do so. If he had done so, he would have won very substantially the referendum, and he'd still be Prime Minister.
So, Matt and Jim, the issue of the next generation, particularly when you talk about the role of social media, what is your current assessment? After all, we've got just under 2 months to run still on the process, but whether the next generation who did have voted in significant numbers in recent presidential elections are alienated by this or encouraged to go out and vote because of the way they see things happening in the current campaign. Matt?
I think social media will obviously encourage more engagement from a public policy standpoint. Whether that translates into actual voting, I think that's to be determined. We've got 50 plus days left of this election. I think across the board, Americans are ready for this election to end. And so,
is there a danger of a low turnout?
I believe that there is a danger for a low turnout, and I think that danger benefits Mr. Trump.
That point about the next generation, Jim?
I completely agree. Look, you're seeing more engagement rates of young voters in politics and social causes, sometimes less political and more, environment or other issues. But I think it's important, it's engaging, and I think you're going to see a continued generation of people having these discussions in ways we didn't before social media. I agree with Matt. Long-term social media will be a very democratizing thing.
All right. That final question I put to you right halfway through the session about the lessons on politics and political reality now to be taken away by this region. And as I reminded the DPM last night, in 2011, Singapore went through a shock politically. As Giorgio remembers, the PAP didn't do well, but they recovered very quickly. There was a change here. What, Matt, quickly is the message about the new political realities in nations in this area which have different levels of voting and democracy?
I think trade as an issue, after this election, there will be a fight for the heart and soul of the Republican Party, and whether it becomes a free trade party once again will be determined soon thereafter on Election Day. As far as TPP, I think it really at this point in time would be a bank shot for TPP to get passed in our current political environment.
Jim?
I will place a small wager that Matt's wrong, and then we'll pass TPP in the lame duck.
But also the
session.
implications for the political class in what we're seeing. Wait a minute.
So I think two things. One, social media and other forms of it mean the political class needs to be way more engaged than they are now, to listening to what their people are saying, to having an ongoing discussion, to not wait till a referendum, to make a case of why it's important to stay in the European Union. You've got to continue to talk to your electorate. President Obama says all the time to his staff, look, this is an ongoing conversation with the American public about where we're taking them. And too often politicians wait to cataclysmic events to react to them. And I think in this age of instant news, you can't do that.
Peter?
My advice to the mainstream politicians and parties in Asia is this. Don't make the mistake that we made of sitting on our lead. Think like CEOs. You may have a great customer base, but there are people, alternatives, competitors coming up on the inside track, and they're nibbling away at your customer base. Ask yourself why they're succeeding. Ask yourself what you're doing wrong. And moreover, don't let if you're a politician, don't let the nationalists, don't let the populists steal the initiative in the way that, frankly, we have done in Britain and in Europe. As a centrist, mainstream politician, don't be ashamed of your views or your centrism. Actually, that is at the end of the day where most voters see themselves, in a moderate centrist sort of way. But you've got to be ahead of the policy game. You've got to anticipate the changes that are taking place in the economy and society and have some answers to what's going to take place in the future. Secondly, you have got to combine more passion with the wisdom that you dispense to the public. And thirdly, now above all, just got to make sure that you have economic growth.
everything that you want to do politically, everything you want to do socially, every way in which you want to make people better off and distribute the gains and the fruits more equally across society will be made easier by economic growth. So make that the priority and take some risks in order to achieve it. We haven't taken those policy risks in Europe to achieve more growth. It's been a mistake, and we've got to rectify that in the coming years.
All right, Peter, thank you very much. And one question just in, reflecting that, is the Western political model, sometimes called liberal democracy, breaking down? Should we here in Asia look for alternative or hybrid political models before we get dragged down too? I think you've just answered that question. Thank you very much indeed. I'm tempted to have a plebiscite here and a fully democratic vote about what's going to happen in the US election, but it's time for tea. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, everyone.